off that exhausting hamster wheel and into balanced living with Dr. Marissa.
Promise you joy in the mystery.
Dr. Marissa, also known as the Asian Oprah. Her mission, to be a beneficial presence on the planet. Her purpose, to be your personal advocate to live, laugh, love, learn. Her life motto, don't die wondering. Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pay.
And welcome. You're tuned into Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show here on NBC News, CNBC News, and NBC Sports Radio Station, AM 1050, FM 106.5, and streaming everywhere. iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Audible, Amazon Music, Tiki Live, Rumble, Podchaser, Spreaker, and more. Why so many places, guy? I want to maximize your splatter zone for more hope and happiness, because I want you to be happy 88% of the time. Why not 100%? Because you'll be dead. I don't want dead people watching or listening or commenting, because you need contrast. We have to have a little unhappiness to know that we're happy. But there's an epidemic out there called unhappiness. And it is part of my mission to help 88 million more happy people in the next 8 years. And that's why I do this now for 642 consecutive weeks. But who's counting? Thanks so much for joining in. Today, we are talking about death. The final frontier. It's a topic that I've been intimately familiar with for this last year. And I've gotten more and more interested. The more I am, my loved ones are getting to that stage where, you know, it's going to happen. We all die. But I was really interested in the question of, you know, how come death is so hard to talk about? We started last Friday. Thank you for that finger. Somebody just gave me, not that finger, but this finger. And I just love it that you're here. Please do identify yourself in the comments. If you are stationary, don't do it while you're driving. But this is streaming on my YouTube TV channel, as well as Facebook, LinkedIn. But Central is YouTube TV. Please subscribe, hit that whatever it is, and that way you'll get an alert every weekday morning. And before we start talking about death, you know the drill if you've been with me for a little bit. A couple years ago, I started really anchoring what I call, my approach or my Kool-Aid to life is, I believe, it's my BS belief system, that mental health, and it is Monday. So we're talking about mental health Mondays because mental health matters. It's so important to not talk about and not look at and not address all of those things that everyone else is talking about. Why? Because most of the time, I'd say at least 88% of the time, if it bleeds, it leads. And if you tune in anywhere else, you will hear all those things that are wrong and bad and, you know, the worst in people, or, what leads you to say, what's wrong with people? So whatever's going on in the news right now, we're not talking about. I get to pick what I want to talk about in areas that I think are kind of bringing us down. And death is one of those things. So I start the show with a breakfast. So you're invited to take a bite out of my gratitude sandwich right now. Top of the bun is things that we're grateful for outside of ourselves. Bottom of the bun is things that we are grateful for inside of ourselves. In other words, appreciation. So that's what we do at the top of every show. I'm going to go really quickly so we can I have a couple of research videos that I found on death, near-death experiences that I'd like to watch. I've never watched them, and you know me, I love to use this platform to learn new things, and I'm so glad that you're here to learn with me. And that's my first gratitude. 642 consecutive weeks. They said this show would last a year, maybe, because I don't talk about the news, because I don't talk about gossip, scandal, K words, Kanye talk, formerly or now. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I have air conditioning because it's been hot. I'm grateful that I have hot showers. I'm grateful that I have a gym that I can roll out of bed before my body protests to go work out. I'm grateful that yesterday I got a beautiful birthday hug and wish from my big brother, Dr. Michael Bernard Beckwith. I am grateful that I have eyeballs here that are joining me, and I'm so grateful that I have bonus mom and dad and sisters and people who love me and I love them in my life. And usually when any kind of tragedy hits, that's the first thing I do is reach out and say, just in case I haven't told you lately, I love you. So that's the top of the bun. You're welcome to start. Hopefully you're already thinking about things that you're grateful for. I have friends, my girlfriend Anne-Marie, she does a gratitude list every morning. It's a good life habit, a hashtag blissipline that we all can benefit from. All right, let's go to the bottom of the bun, which is, what are things that I like about myself? And the good news about mental health awareness is that people are allowed and okay to talk about that their mental health is just not what feels good, or that you're not the best that you can be, you're not your best advocate, you're not acting on your own behalf, you're not encouraging yourself, instead you're angry at yourself. I point to the Olympics because I know Simone Biles is very, very a wonderful role model for being able to talk about mental health and the pressure that she had. But I'll tell you, the one person who really touched my heart was Caleb Dressler. I think it's Dressler. Yeah, swimmer, gold medalist, just like Simone, and went home and just lost himself in the internal critic that is not nice to you. And we all have that internal critic. And I have a book, that today's Mental Health Monday. So you get a free audiobook copy as my Asian Oprah giveaway today. You just go to drmarissa.life and you'll get a free audiobook copy. And in this book, I talk about how that critic can drive us off of a cliff. If you're letting your critic drive you over a cliff, it's time to do that work to know who you really are. You're not that critic. It's just one voice that helped you cope when you were a kid. And I'm one of the 7 out of 10 of us who've had childhood trauma. I spoke on Saturday night and so many people came up and said, yes, I am driven by myself. I'm my own worst critic. No matter what I do, I beat myself up. And that's not a way to live. And that is why we do the bottom of the bun. We want to exercise that muscle on what do you like about yourself. So take a deep breath in through the nose and release. Soft shoulders, soft elbows, soft knees. And first thing that pops into your head, what do you like about yourself? I appreciate my ability to talk. I always ask, how much time do I have? And it's never enough. So I appreciate that part. I appreciate that I don't carry shame anymore most of the time around putting myself out there. It's against the Chinese culture that I grew up in, my home. It was shameful to speak up, be on stage, speak your mind, speak your opinion. And I carried a lot of shame. I still did it, but I carried a lot of shame. And those of you who have heard the story, I apologize. But the moment of clarity that came when I had Rachel Blisson on the show, who's an astrologer, and she said, you're a Leo in 6 planets. We're still celebrating my birthday, by the way, until the end of August. And she said, you just can't help yourself. That's who you are. You got to be on camera, in front. All of that stuff. So that shame lifted. So I appreciate that I like myself 88% of the time. And one more, I appreciate my ability to laugh often and much, which is Emerson's definition of success. So in that, I am successful. So thank you for joining me for breakfast this morning. I promise you, if you also, with or without me in the morning, every weekday morning at 9, starting your day with appreciation and gratitude, you will sandwich your day in most positive ways. So hopefully you'll continue this hashtag Blisscipline, as my big brother will say, or good life habit. All righty, to the topic at hand. I actually wrote an article called Death, the Final Frontier last Thursday morning. And I'll read it to you if we have time. Again, I read it to Ricky on Friday. This is what has spurred this interest. And the best thing about my show is I can learn along with you. And I love doing that. And what I did this morning was just prepare. I didn't watch them, but I prepared 2 videos for you to learn and explore with me. And these are both from, I'm a scientist. My PhD is in organizational psychology. I don't like doing research, but I know the difference between, qualitative, which is wonderful, when people have experiences. But when I first heard about, people who died and came back, I had a little bit, I'm a reluctant woo-woo. And it's like, really? Did that really happen to you? And it's like, wow, that's fascinating. But I don't know, maybe your memory. So I'm a skeptic on some things, just like other people. I tend to be a little gullible sometimes even. So I go to explore things looking at information from people that it's not just a one-off. So I found 2 professors who actually studied for 30 years or more. And I'm going to watch this with you at the same time. And I have not watched them. So this is going to be first time for me. I will reach out after this, depending on, I can't decide. I'll have to decide which one I would like to invite first. But let's just set this up for you. And we're going to skip there we go. And this is Dr. Janice. I'm going to do this and share this screen with you. Okay, let me just share this with you. I do love technology when it works, and it's going to work. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I know that I am. All right.
My name is Janice Miner Holden, and I'm a professor emerita of counseling from the University of North Texas. I spent 31 years on the counseling faculty preparing licensed professional counselors and school counselors. About a third of professors' job is to do research. And so my research area was near-death and related experiences. So for about 3 decades, I was looking into various aspects of near-death experiences and the ways that they relate to counseling, but even beyond that. So I studied everything that is typical about near-death experiences and some particular focus on their connection to counseling. The field of near-death studies actually began, it's credited to have begun in 1975 with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And that's the book where he created the term near-death experience. And he had interviewed about 100 people who'd had near-death experiences and noticed that there were these similarities in their experiences and there were after effects. So he compiled all that in that book. And as a result, people who wanted to do more really controlled scientific research jumped onto the topic. And originally the field focused on the nature of the experience itself and then the after effects. And so those were some of the things that I focused on as well. And then I branched out into other areas, such as there's a phenomenon where somebody who's had a near-death experience and discloses it to somebody else, what kind of experience they have in the way the person reacts to them. And we know that when someone has had a near-death experience and they disclose it, that first disclosure has a big impact on how they're going to proceed to integrate the experience. If the first confidant responds in a helpful way through things like identifying what the experience, that this was a near-death experience, avoiding pathologizing the person or the experience, like not thinking that or saying that it's crazy or that the person's crazy for having had it, not demonizing the experience, saying that it's in some way evil, and acknowledging at least the potential reality, if not the reality of the experience, because it feels absolutely real to people who've had it, then that's a positive disclosure experience, and the person's likely to go on and integrate the experience well. And if the confidant does the opposite of those things, then the person goes on to have problematic process. They kind of get psychospiritually stuck until they encounter an atmosphere in which they can be their experience and they are accepted and help to inquire into the meaning and significance of the experience for them. So I got into that whole disclosure area. And then I also became very interested in the aspect of near-death experiences where the experiencer meets deceased loved ones and the whole phenomenon of after-death communication that also happens to a lot of people outside the context of a near-death experience. So I see my two areas of specialization as near-death experiences themselves, the experience, after effects, disclosure issues, implications for our understanding of consciousness and so forth, and then also after-death communication and the role of that in grief and grief counseling. I've come to conceptualize near-death experiences as having kind of like three levels. At the deepest level are some features that are found in near-death experiences across cultures. So, for example, meeting deceased loved ones is one of them that happens very frequently in near-death experiences across cultures. And perceiving the material world from a position outside the physical body, that's very nearly universal. Moving rapidly through space, whether it's material space or some transmaterial space, that's a common theme. Light is a common theme across cultures in near-death experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that each of these things happens in every experience, but it's more like if you look at 100 near-death experiences or 1,000 of them, you see that these themes recur very commonly among people. So that's that deep kind of almost universal level. And then the next level, the second of the three levels, is what I call the cultural level. And that's where, because in near-death experiences, people are in a different reality than this reality that, this material reality we're in. What they perceive often doesn't directly translate into terms that we use in earthly language. And so people tend to perceive what they're experiencing through their cultural lens because it's the only way they know how to understand or interpret what they're seeing. And sometimes I think culture can even influence what form that universal theme takes. At the third level is what I call the individual level, and that's where no two near-death experiences are exactly alike. And there are always unique personal aspects to each one. So let's just take the theme of moving rapidly through space. In the West, it's real common for people to report that in their near-death experience, they moved rapidly through a tunnel-like structure or some other structure or some other open space. But there's this rapid movement through a non-material space, but that has some form, usually some form. Sometimes it can just be movement through blackness, but it often takes some form like a tunnel-like thing. And in New Zealand, a near-death experiencer might experience themselves moving rapidly over the island of New Zealand toward what they call the jumping off place of souls. So you can see that you've got the same theme of rapid movement, but it's taking a different form depending on whether someone is a Westerner or a native New Zealander, a Maori. But then, even then, if you just look at Westerners who have moved rapidly through a tunnel-like enclosure, no two tunnels are even described alike. Some people say that it's a dark tunnel with a light at the end. Others say that it's a light tunnel that is even brighter at the end. And other people say that it's this undulating with all these colors and things. Some people perceive other spirits in the tunnel, others don't. So you've still got rapid movement through a tunnel-like structure, but it's already taking the rapid movement, the universal theme is taking its cultural form of a tunnel, which tends to be reported more in the West. And then the personal level is that even the specific form and appearance of the tunnel varies from one person to the other. I see a difference between the idea of religion or any aspect of one's cultural upbringing influencing the experience and dictating it. I think that there's definitely influence. I think there's reason to think that it doesn't dictate, because people sometimes have experiences related to religious beliefs that absolutely contradict their religious upbringing. You know, they may expect any of a number of things, but what's going to happen when they have a near-death experience is something that might be very different from what they believed. And one of the most common after effects is people leaving organized religion, not because they're rejecting it, but just because they find that it's too small to explain what they experienced in their NDE, that their religion doesn't account for what they actually experienced and now know to be the nature of death and consciousness and the universe and that sort of thing. One little research study I did was I found all the near-death experience accounts that I could on the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation website, where there are thousands of people who've submitted their NDEs from around the world, really. And the ones that made a reference to Jesus and to describing his physical characteristics. And I found, I think, something like 17 cases. And then I compared, like, what color was his hair? What color were his eyes? What was he wearing? What did his voice sound like? And just the voice, take for example. One person said that his voice was like lilting music. Another said that his voice was like a powerful freight train. And his eyes, one person said they were blue, one said they were brown, one said that his eyes weren't a color, but they emanated light. And I found no two descriptions of Jesus that were identical. There was a little bit of a clue in two of the cases. These were two people who presumably didn't know each other and didn't know about each other's near-death experiences. They just registered on website what they had experienced. And in both of these cases, they had been greeted by a spiritual entity who said, "You're about to meet Jesus." And the experiencer is like, "Okay." And the spiritual entity said, "How would you like him to appear? Because he's very happy to appear in whatever way is easiest for you to perceive." And so it is very much the possibility that we influence how things appear in near-death experiences based on what we are prepared to perceive. Some people will say, for example, that the being of light was God. It's like they had the experience of this being of light, this all-knowing, all-loving force. So they see this being of light and they encounter and sometimes have a sense of merging with this being of light that's all-knowing, all-loving. And some people immediately interpret that this is God. And then other near-death experiencers will say, "You know, I don't know what that was. Maybe that was God, but it's certainly not God the way that I learned about God. So I'm hesitant to put that label on it, but I'll just call it the light or the being of light because that's the form that it took." So people can be interpreting sometimes based on their personal or cultural background. And sometimes when things don't exactly match what they expected, they'll be a little circumspect and not make a commitment as to what that force was. Can we predict who will have a near-death experience? Because to drop way back to the beginning, one of the things we know is that of all the people who survive a close brush with death through serious injury or illness, 80 to 90% of them will come out the other side and say that they don't remember anything unusual at all. They may or may not have lost consciousness. Even if they did when they were unconscious, they have no memory of anything. Only about 10 to 20% of people report a near-death experience, which is an experience of their consciousness functioning apart from their physical body and observing the material world or observing and participating in a transmaterial domain, that is, a world that is not of the material world, but still has environments and entities in it. And so the question arises, why do 80 to 90% of people not remember anything and 10 to 20% of people remember something? Is there something different between those two groups of people? And to encapsulate a whole lot of research into this question, the answer is no. There is no reliable difference between people who do and don't remember NDEs. And furthermore, some people, for one reason or another, have more than one close brush with death, and sometimes they'll have an NDE in one, but not in another. So we truly have no idea. I like to say that heaven only knows why some people have NDEs. And when I say have, I should actually say why some people recall and report a near-death experience, whereas most people don't. We know there are some cases where people actually recall it, but they don't report it until years later. They'll then admit that they had had an NDE, but never spoke about it. But that's a very small number of people. And we also know of cases where people, they say they truly did not remember having an NDE until years later. Something might happen that triggers their memory. So it might be that the people who don't report one had one but aren't reporting it, or had one but don't remember it. But it probably is the case for most people that they just truly didn't have one. And that bears out because in studies of after effects, people who report having had a near-death experience report significantly greater after effects than people who survived a close brush with death without an NDE. And so there's no reason to think these people had an NDE who say they probably didn't, but those who did have very characteristic after effects. And you've probably heard those after effects, people that almost to a person, they report that they absolutely lost their fear of death as a result of the experience, because they now know from experience what the first moments of death are like. And they feel confident that what they experienced characterizes what death will continue to be like if they had stayed dead. That's the biggest one, is the loss of fear of death. I like to break these down into psychological, spiritual, physical, and social after effects. And some of the other psychological ones besides loss of fear of death include things like becoming more compassionate, more emotionally sensitive to other people, more committed to be helpful and kind to other people. That's a lot because of the life review. And then some of the spiritual after effects are becoming more interested in spiritual matters and sometimes tending to become more spiritual rather than religious, although some people do become more religious, but it's a minority. Most people leave organized religion but become much more spiritual. And then also what are sometimes called spiritual gifts, where people have the ability to see the future, to know what another person is thinking, and clairvoyance, see what's happening at distant locations and things like that, what we call paranormal abilities. And then in the physical domain are people, a lot of times after an NDE, their metabolism changes. They may need to eat less food. They may have an aversion to certain foods. they may just generally more sensitive to medication, to pollutants and allergens and things like that. And then also in the physical domain are what are called electromagnetic effects, where electromagnetic things in the person's environment go kaflooey in their presence. And then in the social realm, you can imagine how all these other changes, if the person has psychological, spiritual, and physical changes, they're essentially not the same person they were before their near-death experience, and that can have repercussions in their social world. The reason I'm interested in veridical perception is not just because near-death experiencers almost always say that the experience itself was absolutely real, and often they'll say it's realer than here. I remember in my dissertation study, I was reading the questionnaire response of one of my participants, and when I asked, would you be open if after your NDE, if someone had approached you to talk with you about the extent to which the experience felt real, would you have been willing to talk with them? And rather than answer that question, what he wrote was, that experience was realer than sitting here writing this response to you. And that always, just really stuck with me. Subjectively, it's absolutely real. Near-death experiencers come back with some lessons. And what they tend to say is that our purpose in physical existence is to advance in our capacity to love, to become more loving to each other and to ourselves. In order for humanity to hear the message, they have to really believe that near-death experiences are bringing a genuine message from the spiritual domain of a reality that is incontrovertible, that this is the nature of reality, this is the nature of human existence, and we need to get on board with it. Some people who haven't had experiences like this are on board too, but a lot are not. And understandably, because these experiences are of a qualitatively different nature than our normal material lives. But if humanity is to hear this message, then that the reality of NDEs needs to be established. And that's kind of my most important intention in doing near-death related research.
Wow. Let me give a little applause, and I will reach out. I'll reach out to her to see if she'd like to come on. I have some questions for her, but I don't know what you learned, but I learned for the first time, and I love learning anything new. 80% actually don't remember anything. So the near-death experiences of the thousands of people that have been collected and researched, that's like 20%. So I thought it was a little higher than that. Not saying that it isn't important, but it is one of those, I wonder why the majority don't remember, or, I don't want to go to MSU University, which is making shiitake up, but it was one thing that struck me also, that many leave their religion after having a near-death experience because what they've learned was a little too confining. What they learned was so expansive about what the afterlife is, that religion and its explanation of what happens after you die is too confining or not the same or accurate, which I know I'm a little biased because I'm allergic to religion. I do identify as a spiritual person because I use that definition. Religion is for people who want to avoid going to hell, and spirituality is for those of us who've already been there. But I loved learning that they've become more compassionate after a near-death experience, that they're more loving. And it's sort of that message from the other side for us. I say all the time, let's put humankind, emphasis on kind. So that was fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. Don't go away. We'll be back in 2 and 2. And I'm going to have an interview from another professor and doctor, actually. So we'll see what he says about all of this. We'll be back in 2 and 2.
Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pay.
And welcome back. You're tuned in to Take My Advice. I'm not using a Get Balance with Dr. Marissa, the morning show here on KCAA, the station that leaves no listener behind. AM 1050, FM 106.5, and streaming everywhere. iHeartRadio, Spotify, and of course my show Central that houses all 1,121 podcast shows, and I am delighted that you're here. We're talking because it is Monday, Mental Health Matters Mondays, and I have been very fascinated with this new topic that I really haven't addressed. So I went and asked my assistant Google to help me find some research-based information about near-death experiences. And this has been quite the year. Those of you who know, I was in my first hospital room where my bonus dad's friend was on life support, and there when the life support machine was shut down. And that was my first experience with that. And then I just lost a friend who I've raced sailboats with for 20 years. He was 48, found in the shower by his wife. And he's on the other side at the age of 48. And then Thursday morning, just this past Thursday morning, my bonus sister called and said that my bonus dad, 94 years, had a stroke and was in the hospital in ICU. And as a result of that, I wrote a little article treatise called Death, the Final Frontier. And it also began to make me want to understand near-death experiences. And I've always been an advocate that death is nothing to be afraid of, because I've had on the show Dr. Mary Helen Hensley. Ricky talked about his mom. She was on in the chat about her experience, and all the ones that I've heard, death is nothing to be afraid of because it's beautiful on the other side. And sometimes we, in death, the morbidity, nobody wants to talk about it, nobody wants to think about it, or all of that. I even woke up this morning. It's like a celebration of life. It's a celebration of death. And I know that I'm going out on a limb, and you may not agree with me, and you may think I'm, making light of it. I apologize if that's the way it comes out, but really, I really want people who are unhappy because they miss someone so badly that they can't enjoy their lives and are not happy 88% of the time because of that. That's why we're doing this, to anchor, knowing we all come from love, we all go back to love, and all of the stories that support that, the near life experiences or near death experiences. All right, we're gonna listen to another interview that I found, and this is a doctor who is let's see, we'll make it through there we go. And this is a brain doctor who is interviewing Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is a professor emeritus of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia. And I love, I'm going to reach out to both of them. I didn't know this podcast existed. He's a brain surgeon, and a brain surgeon that deals with woo-woo things. So let's take a listen to this. And I apologize, we're not going to get all the way through it, but let's see if what we can learn with what we can see. All right, here we go.
Check it out. Hey, Bruce, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rick. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk to you about near-death experiences. I've been a fan of your work for a while, so look forward to hearing all your insights in it.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Let me ask you a question, which I think comes to many people's minds. But how did you first get interested in near-death experiences?
It wasn't willingly, I'll tell you that. I grew up in a scientific household, and we never had any thought about anything spiritual or non-physical. So I went through college and medical school with that materialistic mindset. And my first week or two into my residency, I was confronted by a patient who was unconscious. And I couldn't talk with her. She was totally out cold. So I talked to her roommate who had brought her in a different room. And then came back and saw the patient. She was still unconscious. I had her admitted to the intensive care unit. And when I saw her the next morning, I went in to introduce myself. And she said, I know who you are. I remember you from last night. And that kind of blew me away. I didn't know what she was talking about. So she proceeded to tell me about the conversation I had with her roommate, and including intimate details. And I didn't know what to make of that. But, I was an intern. I wasn't there to deal with my problems, but hers. So I just pushed it out of my mind and said, I'll get to it later on. Though in the next several years, I saw more and more patients coming forward with stories like that, and finally realized, as a scientist, I can't ignore these things. I need to look at them and see what's going on here. So I started collecting cases and studying them. And now, half a century later, I'm still trying to understand them.
Super interesting how you got involved and how much you've learned. For our understanding, how common are near-death experiences reported for those who nearly die?
For those who actually have a cardiac arrest, whose hearts stop, about 10 to 20% will describe a near-death experience. There may be more who have them, but just aren't willing to talk about them.
And does the acuity of the near-death experience affect the phenomena? So, for example, an acute car accident versus being under anesthesia and having a code blue during a surgery, does that affect the phenomena?
That's a difficult question to answer, Rick. If you look at patients whose hearts stop compared to patients who have a heart attack, but the hearts never actually stop, the rate is much higher among those who have a true cardiac arrest. And yet we see the same types of near-death experiences in people who don't have documented cardiac arrest. For example, falling from mountaintops or being in car accidents. As far as we know, there's no physiological proximity to death, and yet they have a full-blown near-death experience.
So it's really the cardiac arrest that's that unifying factor amongst all of these people.
Well, that's what we've been studying, because those patients are easy to study. But we haven't looked at people who have respiratory arrests or head traumas and so forth.
Now, of course, obviously those are much more difficult to look into.
Right.
Another very interesting question, right? Because people might think that this is spiritual. Does this vary according to religion, gender, race, age? Are you seeing any differences?
We're not, Rick. Certainly religion or religiosity does not determine whether you're going to have a near-death experience or what kind you're going to have. Ethnicity, gender, age do not seem to make a difference either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting to see that whether you are religious or not, and to what extent that you're religious, doesn't make a difference. You would think that someone who lives their life incredibly devoted to God and religion, there's a higher chance of having these, but obviously you're saying it's not. So that's interesting to see that it's so uniform amongst those populations.
Right. I've known people who were atheists who never had any belief at all in a deity, who had a full-blown near-death experience. I will say, though, that most near-death experiencers say that there aren't any words to describe what happened to them. So when we push them to describe them, they end up using metaphors. And the metaphors they use may come from their religion. So, for example, many people will say, I encountered this warm, loving light. And if you happen to be a believer in God, you may say, this was God. Whereas if you're not, you wouldn't use that word. So your metaphors may be determined in part by your culture or your belief system.
So it affects your interpretation
Exactly.
of the near-death experience. It does not affect the actual near-death experience in itself.
That's right. That's right.
Now, so it does not vary according to religion, age, gender, ethnicity, and anything like that. But what are some unifying themes of these experiences that you have seen as you interview these patients? Do they all have a white light? You hear about the classic tunnel that people go down, outer
Right.
body, childhood memories. What have you seen over and over again in these people?
Well, consistently, they have a strong sense of peace and well-being. And this is in the context of coming close to death, which is usually painful and frightening. And all of a sudden, they're overwhelmed by this sense of everything is fine. They often feel like their thoughts are speeded up and much more clear than they ever had been before. Again, surprising with a brain that's under stress. They often have a sense of leaving the physical body. Maybe a third of them will describe that. They may have a sense of reviewing their entire lives. Some people may go on to encounter beings that aren't physically present that they may interpret as being deceased loved ones or deities. And they may come at some point to a point of no return, beyond which they can't keep going, and they'll decide to come back, or sometimes are sent back against their will.
It's so interesting because these are such abstract thoughts and abstract events on a very tangible event, someone dying.
Right.
In your opinion, what do these experiences represent? It's obviously it's impossible to know for sure, but in your opinion, what do these phenomena represent?
That's the $1 million question, Rick. I don't know the answer to that. I went into this as a materialist, convinced that I was going to find a simple physiological explanation for this. And every hypothesis we've been able to test, lack of oxygen, drugs given to patients, endogenous drugs produced by the brain, does not seem to be correlated with the near-death experience. So we don't have a simple physiological explanation. That doesn't mean we'll never find one. We just haven't yet in the first 50 years of research. But science goes slowly. I don't know what they mean. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. I can't really speak to non-scientific explanations for this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we end up saying science just can't explain it.
Now, as a neurosurgeon, just, prior to talking to you, but obviously having followed your work, I would have thought that it was pretty straightforward, right? You have anoxia, lack of blood flow to the brain, hallucinations. The brain is not functioning as well as it should because it's not getting the oxygen and the blood supply. So you start hallucinating. But interesting. So none of that correlates. So if you have a healthy patient and you try to replicate all of those physiological factors, none of them trigger a near-death experience.
Not reliably, certainly. For example, if you look at oxygenation levels of patients who are coming close to death, those who have near-death experiences tend to have higher blood oxygen levels than those who don't have NDEs. Now, of course, that just may mean those with better oxygen supply may be better at remembering what happened to them than those who didn't.
Interesting.
Wix gives you the power of AI to build the website you need with full business function.
Yeah, wow. It's what an interesting field and how difficult to interpret, because just like you said, you and I are both scientists. We rely on evidence, and now there's minimal evidence, and a lot of it is theory, and so it becomes much more abstract. And
That's right. That's right.
the other question is, how do these near-death experiences change life for the patients that you've seen, right? Do these events change their life for the better, for the worse? Are they traumatized?
They have very, very powerful effect on people's lives. And it's, for some people, it's for the better. For some people, it presents more challenges. They almost consistently say that they are no longer afraid of death after a near-death experience. No matter what they describe the experience as having been, they're no longer afraid of dying after this. And paradoxically, that makes them no longer afraid of living to the full extent. They're more likely to take risks, to live to the fullest. If something happens and they have an accident, what's the worst that can happen? They die, which is good for them. So they tend to be much more outgoing, much more impulsive, and enjoy life a lot more. They also tend to say that they are much more spiritual, and they don't mean religious by that. They tend to say that they feel equally at home in any house of worship of any denomination, or even just out in nature. But they feel the intense connection to other people, to the natural world, to the divine, which they didn't necessarily have before. Well, let me caution about that, because it's not easy to come back to a quote normal life after you've had this pronounced change in all your attitudes and beliefs and values. It can be very trying for the experiencers' families and their children and so forth. I've known people who had to. I'm sorry. I know people who've had to change their careers because of this. People who were in career military officers or career police officers who could not shoot after a near-death experience and had to change their careers. It certainly can, right. They also tend to become much less invested in material goods, power, prestige, fame, which may make them feel much more comfortable with their lives, but it doesn't make them get ahead in our Western culture.
Yeah, definitely does not get you ahead. So that's very interesting. What now? I guess the $1 million question is, how do you do research on these near-death experiences? Again, you and I are both doctors, scientists, and research is conducted in a very methodical fashion with hypotheses and data and then conclusions.
Right.
How do you advance our knowledge on near-death experiences? Obviously, it's a tough road.
Right. Unfortunately, we can't perform experiments where we give some people near-death experiences and others not. You just can't do that to people. So we're left with having to capture them after the event and retroactively try to reconstruct what they were like before this, what their personality was like, and what the physiological events of the near-death event were like, which is sometimes possible, sometimes not. It would be great to have brain imaging on all these people, but it almost never occurs. So we're stuck with looking at people after the fact, which is not the best source of evidence. But we can look at what's going on, see what the medical records say about it, see what friends and family say about what they were like beforehand, how they've changed and so forth. And there are some objective measures, like behavioral measures, of how they have lived their lives before and after. And we do find that people become much more altruistic after a near-death experience, much less competitive.
Now, you were talking about brain imaging. Obviously, very hard to get an MRI or a CAT scan. I mean, do you have any brain imaging? Do you have any examples of what the MRI showed during these events, or a CAT scan, or EEG? I mean, potentially someone's having seizures and they have an EEG before they die. Have you had EEG recordings? This episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take is brought to you by Vitamin Water. Vitamin Water is the ideal way to hydrate, replete your electrolytes, and maintain wellness. I
drink while they're having an EEG done, and they don't show consistent things. Most of our data on EEGs during cardiac arrest show flatlining in a matter of 20, 30 seconds. And you see immediate changes within a few seconds, decrease. But there have been isolated reports of people who had continued identifiable brain waves for 30 seconds or so after the heart stops. So it's hard to know what to make of these data. We do have occasional CAT scans of people who were in comas that show severely compromised brain structure that doesn't tell you about function. But we've seen brains that were virtually no corrugations on the outside of the brain. It was so full of pus. We don't have MRIs. We don't have sophisticated data. People have tried to take near-death experiencers, put them in an MRI, and have them try to recreate the near-death experience. Now, that's not the same thing as having the experience. But what we find is when they do that, virtually the entire brain gets activated, which is not that surprising because it involves memories, it involves visual, auditory sensations, involves thought processes. So it wouldn't be surprising if you don't find one particular area that's associated with a near-death experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you could get a functional MRI or a PET scan during a near-death experience, that'd be amazing. But like you said, there's more important things like trying to save the person's life.
Right, exactly.
So You are the author of the best-selling book After, and tell us
Yes.
a little bit about your impetus to write that book. At what point were you like, I got to put everything together so people understand what's going on?
Well, I've been thinking about that for decades, but it wasn't until I retired in 2014 before I started working on this in a serious fashion. Um, and I tried to put the story out there through my eyes, how I came to approach this as a materialist and how my thinking changed over the decades as I learned more and more about these experiences, and try to bring the reader along with how my thought may have changed, and hopefully show them that what we thought we knew isn't necessarily something we need to hold on to as inviolate. That in science, all of our conclusions are tentative. We never have all the data.
Let the world take care of the publishing part. That's not your job. I wrote every day for 15 years before my first book came out.
Yeah. So there's obviously room to grow there. And I want to get into your perspective, because it's tough to read a book and really get into someone's mind. But in your
Right.
opinion, what have your experiences and your vast amount of knowledge on this topic, what have they shown you about what happens when we all inevitably die?
Well, there's a lot of suggestions, not only from near-death experiences, but from other phenomena as well, that under extreme circumstances, the connection between brain and mind that we see in everyday life doesn't necessarily hold as fast as you're approaching death. There are times when the brain seems to be fading, when our thoughts and perceptions seem to be clearer and sharper than ever before. And that doesn't make sense in terms of what we know now about neurophysiology. But as you said, we don't know it all yet. But it looks as if, as the brain seems to be failing in its usual modes, consciousness seems to be expanding. I can't explain that, but we can observe it in things like near-death experiences, in terminal lucidity, in which people with end-stage Alzheimer's suddenly become lucid in the moments before death. We've done neuroimaging with people with psychedelic drugs who have elaborate mystical experiences. And we find that the more mystical experiences we see with those are associated with a decrease in brain activity and a connection between different parts of the brain. So again, there seems to be that under extreme circumstances, the connection between mind and brain that we see in everyday life seems to fall apart, or at least become modulated.
I'm going to get into that in more detail.
This is one of those times where I really wanted to keep going, but this is, take my advice, I'm not using it. Get Balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show. We are on KCAA, and I am out of time for the morning show, but wow, I just love learning new things. And this whole area of NDE, near-death experience, as I, am getting front row seats to watching loved ones, and in that final frontier of life, and knowing that where they're going is not a horrible place. And just this research here around what happens in all the thousands of accounts. And I love the fact that, these are two scientists and doctors who are not woo-woo people. I'm a reluctant woo-woo myself, and having to admit that this is real. And anyways, I'm really out of time. Thanks for joining me, Nemesis of Eden. Always nice to see you as well. I hope that you learned something. We'll obviously keep talking about this. Maybe next Mental Health Monday we'll do the other half, but it's all about balance. Peace in, peace out, world peace through inner peace. Now go and have the best day ever. We'll see you tomorrow.
Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pay.